Tonight's esteemed speaker is Mr. Peter Plagens. He's an artist, journalist, critic, novelist, and for all the students who are here from the art department, he holds that most powerful position of exhibition juror. So hopefully you all did well, and it's going to be a great show there too. His paintings and artwork have been featured in solo exhibitions at places like the Hirshhorn Museum, Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art, the Akron Art Museum, Butler Institute. He's represented by Nancy Hoffman Gallery, one of the wonderful established artists in Soho, moved up to Chelsea, and he's also shown in solo exhibitions in Chicago, Los Angeles, and elsewhere. His work is in the collections of major museums such as the Albright Knox Museum, Baltimore Museum of Art, the Hirshhorn Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and in major corporate collections such as Chase Manhattan and Prudential. Mr. Plagens has received numerous fellowships and awards, including a Guggenheim, 3 NEA grants, Brown Foundation, and several others. You've probably read some of his writing in Art in America, Artforum, Art in Auction, Los Angeles Times, New York Observer, Newsweek, and elsewhere. And lest I forget, he's also a teacher and has taught classes at some pretty impressive places like NYU, Middlebury College, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Cal State, UC Berkeley, and in the distant past, I think, the University of Texas at Austin. So I think proof that a good college education pays off. He took his BFA at the University of Southern California and MFA from Syracuse in New York. I think probably came from somewhere in the middle of all of that as an Ohioan. But without further delay, let me turn the podium over to Mr. Peter Plagens, and please join me in welcoming here tonight.
Those introductions. I'm probably guilty. The explanation for most of it is that I'm 71 years old and I've been around for a long time. Let's see. There it is. That's the title of the talk. It's about painting. And I'm sorry if some of you are having to stand, and I wish I could make this a laugh a minute kind of thing where the time would just fly by, but it's probably not going to. I won't tell you what it timed out as when I practice it. I'm not used to playing SRO, you know. First, I would like to thank the Jewel Collins Smith Museum of Art at Auburn University for inviting me here to speak. I do like the idea that the museum got its start from a prescient head of the School of Art here buying 36 paintings at auction for about $1,000 total, and that the group contained work by such socially conscious artists as Ben Shahn, Jacob Lawrence, and that in the Deep South in the days of Jim Crow, such works by such African-American artists as Lawrence and Romare Bearden. That it took 55 years for the museum that original collection was supposed to help create to open its doors is perhaps a little chastening, but on the bright side, this is a fresh new institution, and I'm very happy and flattered to have been included in its initial decade of programs. Now about the talk. It's longer than I would like. I'm sorry again for the people who are standing. But that's what happens when you invite an artist who's also a critic and who has a penchant for words to talk about art. It's also what I call a back and forth talk, although it's essentially a defense of, or more accurately, a reason for being for painting in the highly digitalized 21st century, I'll tell you some bad things about painting, then I'll tell you some good things about painting, some more bad things, and then end up with some more good things. I took this photograph. It's not a great photograph, but it was ambience. Went to see him to do a piece a long time ago. A word about images. They're neither art historically correct. My captions, which have only the artist names and sometimes a date, which is often approximate, don't have all the specs, nor are they perfect examples of what I'm talking about. I intend them as a kind of prompt to give you something generally related to what I'm saying to look at and to think about while I'm talking. Also, often the images aren't textbook masterpieces. You've all seen those. So I might show one that I think appropriate and, at least to me, more viscerally connected to the art of painting. And one of the virtues of painting is, by the way, that it's a relatively visceral art form, but we'll get to that a bit later. Painting at its best is a noble enterprise with a long pedigree. For several hundred years in Europe, the easel painting, including some that were obviously too big to be worked on while propped on an easel, Velázquez's Las Meninas is almost in that category, was, if not the primary, at least a very important medium in which religious, social, political, and of course aesthetic ideas were communicated. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, the mass reproduction of printed images and photography, painting's importance as a means of public communication, even just among the classes moneyed enough to see lots of paintings, diminished. But at about the same time that it lost some of its power as a public medium, modern art arose. Some would say modern art was both a reaction to the industrialization of society. In other words, if you can't beat it, join it, or at least depict it, and a retreat from it. After all, one of the almost mandatory qualities of a painting is that it be handmade. Whatever the case, painting's place in the beginning of modern art is crucial, if not singular. Whether you place the beginning of modern art with, as many art historians do nowadays, J.M.W. Turner, who, by the way, benefited from the color yellow being chemically made and readily available in the part of the 19th century that he was working, just like the Impressionists benefited from the invention of tubed paint, an aside there on industrialized society. Anyway, if you think it begins with J.M.W. Turner or Manet, you know, and we all know your date is the Salon of 1863, Pablo Picasso, and ugly old Cubism, painting was, as they say, the straw that stirred the drink, and it held its position as being, to mix cliches here, on the cutting edge of the avant-garde all the way through the 1940s and 1950s with abstract expressionism, and even into the irony of pop art in the 1960s. But ever since the tsunami of irony, homage to pop culture, and a kind of egalitarianism of media were exponentially accelerated by pop art, painting has become, in percentages of important, I put scare quotes around that, important artists on the art world's list of them, less and less important. Whatever the media and style changes wrought over the last, say, 60 years or so in the Western art world, it's Western with a capital W, one thing that stays constant among contemporary artists now and modern and postmodern artists of the recent past is that they want to be important. What does important mean? Important means a combination of famous within that serious gallery and museum circuit known as the art world, and influential on other artists. Even if you're a young artist, you want to be considered as influential on your peers or even on older artists who might revivify themselves by picking up a trick or two from you. These days, if you want to be considered an important artist, you almost have to do something other than be a painter. You should do installation art, video, or photography, provided that it's digitally manipulated enough. A Russian contemporary artist named Dmitry Gutov, whose work includes everything from video to metalwork to installation art to painting, has said, "Today there is nothing more pitiful, unnecessary, senseless, and useless than painting." Of course, he qualifies the statement by adding that he means painting in the classical sense. He means painting by painters, that is, by artists who have voluntarily confined themselves to or specialize in painting. Painting by artists who are Promethean enough to create in all the modes in which Mr. Gutov works are presumably exempt from this criticism. An artist who, like Gutov, worked in a plethora of media once said to me, "I use many languages in my art. Painting is just one of those languages." After our conversation, it came to me, in what they call l'esprit de l'escalier, the thing you think of on the staircase on the way out that you should have said, that I should have asked if she was fluent in that language. But painting is a rather slow medium, and since I am a painter, I can sometimes be slow too. If looked at from an impatient, unsympathetic, might makes right art world power angle, painting can indeed look pitiful, unnecessary, and useless. This painting, called Mchugh's Rock by Nick Miller, an Irish artist I know who works from a bare-bones mobile studio contained in the back of a box truck, isn't as flashy and realistically grabbing as a giant sea print of a similar subject might be. I think I know that because at a recent art fair, I encountered a very well-known art critic positively enraptured by a big color Thomas Struth photograph of a similar subject. Some people in the art world, hipper than I am, might regard a painting such as Miller's to be pitiful, in the sense that it takes so long to make sense of, unnecessary, in the sense that a big color photograph can get you a clearer image a lot quicker, and useless, in the sense that it's just another one-of-a-kind, as was once said about handmade art objects on the West Coast a long time ago, another one-of-a-kind bauble for the rich. Physically, paintings are now relatively modest visual phenomena, especially when compared to or in comparison with, as they are in exhibitions such as the Whitney Biennial, big film and video projections. But back in the 1960s and 1970s, people in the art world spoke of a wow factor, because some paintings, mostly abstract ones and mostly in the convenient water-based medium of acrylic, became really big. Nowadays, however, paintings aren't as big and bright as a lot of film and video projections, and not as encompassing as room-size indoor installation works of art, let alone outdoor ones. So work by Jennifer Steinkamp. The work is what's on the screen there. The architecture is just where it was housed. Then there's history and technology passing painting by. To paraphrase an earlier point, for about 250 years, we haven't really needed paintings to tell stories, document events, or to celebrate world leaders. Painting, as Mr. Gutov remarked, is unnecessary. So it doesn't make much sense for artists who want to be considered important in the contemporary art world to paint. The abstract expressionist painter Robert Motherwell, in a lecture I attended a long time ago, I was an undergraduate, described painting as, and I'm quoting from memory here, a piece of cloth tacked to some boards, defaced by means of a stick with hairs on the end of it dipped in colored grease. That sounds awfully pitiful, unnecessary, senseless, and useless, doesn't it? This is the niche into which painting, long ago a very refined and sophisticated way of depicting the physical appearance of the natural and cultural world, and for a while a celebrated method of manifesting in 2 dimensions and with color the painter's personal emotions or aesthetic theories or both, has been pushed. Although there are considerable disadvantages for painting in this position, one of them is being exhibited in the Whitney Biennial exhibitions on walls that actually vibrate and bleed sound from installation art on the other side, there is a certain sense of freedom in it. There is very little pressure for painting to be sensational because, except for pornographic content, painting can't. There's little energy wasted by painters in the hope that they'll be considered the next hot item in the art world. And there is less of a competition to see which paintings can really make somebody's eyeballs wobble, because electronic media can do that so much better. Painting has been technologically outdated for purposes of representing what's going on in the world for about 170 years, when the French academic painter Paul Delaroche, albeit probably apocryphally, said upon seeing his first daguerreotype, "From today, painting is dead." But that's only one side of the technology coin. The problem isn't just that painting can't be realistic, i.e. photographically real, as well as photography can. It's that photography, now digital, now malleable by such computer programs as Photoshop and others much more sophisticated, can now do better than painting what painting, since the invention of photography, has staked as its claim to our attention. That is, photography can make a more visually complicated, expressionist or surrealist figurative image better than painting can. And given the almost infinite trove of digitalized photographic images with which to work, photography doesn't even have to start with taking photographs anymore. It doesn't have to place or find some physical objects in front of a lens, or train its lens on something in the real world and snap the shutter to get its starting point. It can cut to the chase of a digital palette, indeed a digital museum of countless images already inside the computer. Just as photography supplanted painting as nonfiction, so to speak, 170 years ago, for about the last quarter century, photography has increasingly supplanted painting as an art of fiction. Sometimes photography actually is painting. When Jeff Koons exhibited photographic images of himself having sex with his then wife, the porn actress Alana Staller, the images were printed via the jet spray technique with oil paint on canvas and then varnished. Physically, at least, they were paintings. Little commercial here. This is one of my wife's paintings. Bad photograph taken by me in the studio with a little camera, so that's why it sort of fisheyes a little on the vertical edges. And it's a studio photograph. You can see the nails in the wall. Then there is painting's problem of being so convention-bound. Think of the term painting in the work of art sense, and what pops into your mind. Chances are the painting you first imagine is a flat, static rectangle. It might be painted with water-based paints rather than oil-based, and it might be on paper, wood, or even metal than on canvas. It might even be of a slightly different shape than a rectangle, an oval or a circle, or adjoined rectangles of different sizes. But if it strays too far from those conventions, it will be perceived as a sculpture. Sculpture, on the other hand, is far less constrained. Sculpture is so unconstrained by convention, in fact, that a contemporary sculpture that's a cohesive object made from one material and sits on some kind of base looks pretty old-fashioned. An artist friend of mine once sarcastically referred to a conservative college art department sculpture program as the Department of Statues. And up at the nation's most prestigious art graduate school at Yale, the painting department is very convention-bound, while the sculpture department is, in effect, the department of everything else. Finally, in regard to other modes of making visual art, painting shares with conventional sculpture the politically incorrect quality of consisting of unique handmade objects. Now, there are billions of unique handmade objects in the world, a good many of them having a primarily aesthetic intent. That is, they were made to be looked at. So what's wrong with painting consisting of same? It's not a morphological problem, except in the sense that the size of an audience for a unique handmade physical object is necessarily much smaller than that for an object which can be reproduced in identical thousands or hundred thousands or millions, but a public relations problem. Paintings make the news when, usually at auction, they sell to some obscenely rich person for, and I see this phrase a lot, an ungodly sum. Sometimes the figures come from art fairs where the numbers are much lower, say $500,000 instead of $50 million, but they are still daunting. Among younger artists and critics, these daunting numbers are unpleasant, if not actually politically repulsive. What painting did wrong in its niche? Painting committed what might be called a slow structural suicide. Well, maybe attempted suicide, because it didn't quite kill itself. Painters tried reducing the means of their painting so that they could paint the last possible painting. That is, the point of their paintings was, here are the absolute bare essentials of painting. You know, Robert Ryman's white paintings. Any further reduction will result in either the disappearance of painting or its totally blending into mundane things in the real world, like, say, painted garage doors. Early on in modernism, reductivist painting was tied to big ideas that transcended painting. In the case of Kazimir Malevich, it was the communist revolution in which all economic exploitation would be done away with. Those of you in maybe taking your first art classes, you know who Malevich was and what it was. Suprematism, you know, 1912 to 15, somewhere in there. Such a universalist new world needed a new universalist art, which was called suprematism, simple geometric shapes at profound play. Everyone from farmer to industrial laborer to communist commissar could understand it. That's theoretically, because they tried it out and it didn't work. You know, they sent that train around Russia with all the stuff on it as little mobile museums, and what the people in the countryside wanted, of course, was 19th century romantic art, only with the characters changed. In the case of Piet Mondrian, a little later, the big idea was an extension of his religious belief, theosophy, that there were immutable laws of harmony that governed the universe and that could be expressed in primary colors, red, yellow, blue, plus black and white, and with 90-degree angles only. If you know who Ad Reinhardt is, this is a bit of a joke. He's famously the painter of the all-black paintings, which are not really just all black. They're like tic-tac-toe grids that are very, very, very subtly differentiated. With the likes of Ad Reinhardt and Robert Ryman in America and after World War II, reductive painting took an inward, existential turn. Although Reinhardt would nominally be paired with Mondrian in putting his reductivist painting to spiritual ends, there's a real difference between them. Mondrian looked outward, Reinhardt looked inward. Mondrian was an astronomer. Reinhardt was a subatomic particle physicist. The trouble with inward-looking reductivism in painting is that, unlike science that looks at smaller and smaller goings-on and gets more exciting as it does, inward-looking reductive painting gets tiresome. Unless you're a Zen Buddhist, the same black painting done over and over and over and seen over and over gets boring. On the other hand, small or subtle variations in the visual theme like that seem like retreats from principle. They seem like corruptions. The opposite tack to reductionism has been to say, in effect, oh, the hell with any kind of purity, or keeping corruptions out of painting. The contemporary world is a big, messy place with all images of all kinds and ways of being made slam into us from everywhere. And painting, like any other art form that wants to stay alive, should, one way or another, depict that world. Why this happened, though, wasn't just because the real world, scolded out of painting by photography in the 19th century and early 20th century, came barging back into painting in the form of media. That was a big part of it, though. It was partly the result of the way brokers of painting and teachers of painting, myself included, in spades, tried to proselytize painting to other people. We wallowed in color reproductions in art magazines. We watched and showed our students hours of film and videos about painting. We gave endless lectures with side-by-side projectors. Now we give PowerPoint presentations like this one. All of this insidiously undermines our basic confidence in the single static painting hanging on a wall, seen in the flesh. The conceptual artist John Baldessari said to me once that our generation of teachers who were interested in earthworks and big installations enthusiastically showed students slide after slide, photograph after photograph of earthworks and big installations. And what did their students go on to do as their own works of art? Photographs, naturally. The moderately conservative New York art critic and champion of painting, David Cohen, and you can get him on the web on something called artcritical.com. David Cohen has, as one is wont to do with something one loves, pointed out three things in contemporary painting that he thinks demean it. The categories are David's, the examples are solely mine. The first is what he calls conceptually driven academicism. In other words, good old-fashioned realism that is tarting up painting's mimetic capabilities with superficially sophisticated, lightly shocking ideas. The second is kitsch. By kitsch, David doesn't mean just the iconography of Mickey Mouse or Hello Kitty or rock and roll glam photos all done with a wink and a nod. He also means the mechanics of kitsch, bits of business, kitsch building blocks, if you will, that were formerly considered evidence that a painting wasn't serious. That's a whole thing, by the way, as an aside, I haven't figured out, which is the sort of, machoization of Rococo. Like if you see, you know, WEC on television before they have these blood-curdling bouts on, it says, and then there's all this kind of Baroque curlicue stuff that comes around the screen. And, you know, and tough guys on the subway wear sweatshirts that all look like something that Louis XVI might have worn. You figure it out. Finally, according to David Cohen, there's mannerism, the attenuation to the breaking point of tweeness or feiness in a painter's style. A popular mannerism is a feigned weakness, in the same way that teenagers who go goth superficially look like they've given up on life, look like they think there's no point in trying to succeed because success is corrupted and only the assholes in high school succeed. But behind the surface of mannered weakness, they have a very feisty and defiant alternative idea of just what success really is. I don't mean that all the painters I've just exampled under what painting did wrong in its niche are bad painters, or that the paintings I've exampled are bad paintings. Some painters who paint in these styles I admire, at least up to a certain point, although I still disagree with their overall approaches to painting. What I mean to point out is that what they have or had fastened onto as life-giving in painting have, at least to me, made painting situation in contemporary art all the more problematic. This is a little, I'm going to put in a commercial here. This is a little painting, and there's somewhere in the near future, year and a half, there's going to be a huge George Bellows show at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Washington, as we all know, Baltimore now is the northernmost southern city. So it's Washington, D.C. is in the south. You should be able to get there. Bellows, who died fairly young, was a great painter. This little painting is going to be in the show. It's in a little museum in Connecticut called the New Britain is Art. And this painting, every time I see it, it just kills me. It's small. It almost looks to me like he loaded a great big brush as a stunt with all the different colors and then painted it in one stroke, you know, maybe one loop around the canvas. And I've never seen that simply done, that feeling of the way bright but cold sunlight can cut through a gray, you know, a gray sky. Anyway, Bellows is absolutely great, and I use him as an example of there is a kind of perceptual staying power in painting simple physicality. It's parallel, I think, to what one experiences in theater as opposed to movies. My wife, who's a painter, simply cannot remember movies. We can go see the biggest, loudest, most special effects-laden spectacular, and 2 weeks later she'll recall only the basics of the plot. But if we go to see a play, even a talky drama with a few actors on a bare stage, she'll remember everything for a long time. Me too. Predisposition obviously plays a part. Not everybody would stop and pay attention to physically modest paintings that draw me or other painters in. But I still think there's something in the physical immediacy of painting that trumps a lot of work that uses, for instance, large video projections with prominent sound. Part of that physical immediacy is being able to stand in front of a painting at about the same distance the painter who created it did when he or she painted it. If you don't get a tingle when you do this with de Kooning's painting called Excavation, which I couldn't find a projectable image, I couldn't find a big enough, you know, TIFF file to project, but his painting called Excavation, it's in the Art Institute of Chicago. If you don't get a tingle when you do this with de Kooning's Excavation, I wish I could have found a projectable images of it, or Velázquez's Las Meninas in the Prado, or a Joan Mitchell abstraction, then your sensibility for art, I'd say, is fairly truncated. Painting's restrictive, and this is one of the disadvantages or advantages. This is a fairly small, and Thomas Niskowski paints about like that size. Painting's restrictive conventions, being flat, static rectangles and being made with a certain few materials, with a certain few tools in a somewhat limited way, turn out to be virtues. Painters have to squeeze, pun intended, a whole lot out of a comparative little. An artist I know who made conceptual work and did performances in Los Angeles said to me back in the late 1970s, "Don't you think it's strange that 80% of the work in the galleries is made from about 2% of the available materials in the world?" In the 1990s, she came to painting and has stayed there ever since. This is a poster, obviously, not a painting. Painting also has a resistance to it. It develops slowly, and the materials fight the painter. Every new move comes at a cost. I draw a parallel with graphic design and why posters from the 1920s and 1930s still look so good. It's because every bell and whistle that the designer could add, an additional color, halftone for photo reproduction, came at a cost, literally a money cost. With computer technology, all kinds of effects, shadow boxing, metallic reflection, montaged imagery, etc., can be had fairly cheaply. And so a lot of graphic design these days has an uncritical Baroque indulgence to it. There are now ways of simulating paintings on smartphones and iPads. For instance, an app called Brushes. And some painters, notably David Hockney, are interested in them, but Hockney is already a near great painter who likes to fool around with new devices as a kind of sideline. He did it with Polaroid photography back in the day, but such programs and apps, when they're used primarily to free the artist from the constraints of time and the resistance of traditional materials, encourage that uncritical Baroque indulgence. Plus, the result isn't really a painting, but a digital approximation of one. Finally, painting is still naturally more abstract and or more abstracted than other art mediums. And when it's good, it gets its strength from formal values, composition, color, shape, character, and the rest. Formal values, while certainly not eternal, come closer than being immutable than iconography, social or political content, or technological spectacle. Ever since the invention of relatively permanent photography in the middle of the 19th century, impermanent photography in the form of light coming through a pinhole in one wall and projecting an unpreservable image on the opposite wall was known as far back as the 6th century Byzantium. Painting has been an art of skepticism. Just as the map can never equal the territory, the painting can never equal the subject. Painters know this. They know their colored grease, their cloth tacked over some boards, their fairly crude tools called brushes can only approximate, can only hint at the subject. The miracle is that such knowledge, which results in an unconquerable skepticism about the whole project of representing something in a painting, or, if it's an abstract painting, about the whole project of conjuring something more philosophically nutritious than eye candy out of the materials of painting, is oddly liberating for the serious painter. If you want to go deep about this skepticism, read the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty's 1945 essay, Cézanne's Doubt, in which he talks about the unbridgeable gap between the cool, ordered perspective of objects to a theoretically single cyclopean eye, and the haptic, ever-changing perspective of objects in life as lived by a flesh and blood human being. Merleau-Ponty also says something about Cézanne's desiring to capture reality on the canvas while denying himself the means, photographic perspective, precise drawing, smooth paint application, to achieve it. I'd say that Cézanne doesn't deny himself these means so much as realize that in the dialogue between his colored grease and hairy sticks and his subject of a still life or a landscape, and you can see the building blocks of Cézanne over there on the left, may or may not be unfinished. It's unfinished, but it may or may not be deliberately unfinished. And between his colored grease and hairy sticks and his subject of a still life or a landscape, capturing reality is not only impossible but undesirable. A painting is always provisional, and that is one of its virtues. And a painting is always unfinished, at least for the attentive viewer. The paintings that fascinate me most, from painstaking semi-medieval early Flemish oils on wood panels to Cy Twombly's existential scribbles on large canvases, are the ones that I can change, i.e. move the parts around, alter the colors, etc. in my head. I'm making the unprovable point here that great paintings are the ones that don't seem absolutely finished, sealed, and locked up. I've heard it said that as painting goes, so goes art itself. That is, if painting is dead or becomes, as the painter Paul Braque said about 40 years ago, the cloisonné of our time, then art itself is dead. Superficially, this means that if pictures in gold frames hanging on museum walls become just another leveled off branch of cultural production, then we might as well go to the movies. Deeper, it means that what's called fine art is, in the end, nothing but an elitist fetish. Another bellows. I think that's the construction of Penn Station in New York. That's what Bellows was interested in, was the hole in the ground, not the, And look at that thing. I mean, he's got the snow, he's got that light, he's got the building backlighted, he's got, sunset or sunrise, probably sunset. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Obviously, I don't think that what's called fine art or simply contemporary art in a museum such as this university has is nothing but an elitist fetish whose only legitimate forms are messy installation that make holes in the wall and floors as a form of institutional critique. That's got scare quotes around it too. And I do think in some indefinite medium term way that the preservation of an entity called art with a capital A is dependent on the continued viability of painting, even in its niche. Roberta Smith, the New York Times first-string art critic, says that young artists today, quote, feel freer to paint what they want than at any time since the 1930s, or maybe even the 1890s, when post-impressionism was at its height, unquote. I think that feel freer means a combination of the liberating sense of not standing much of a chance of being the hottest item in today's glitzy, hyper-hip, reality TV type art world, and a vague sense of the responsibility for keeping art, with a capital A, alive as something other and better than a leveled off branch of cultural production. Having said all this, and we're at the end now for everybody standing, having said all this, I think I have a bit of a duty to show what I do in regard to all of this. I'll show 3 images. The first is a painting I made going on 40 years ago, and it's a big painting, not that big, but I made going on 40 years ago. I've been a painter for a long time. The second image is a painting I made last year. And the third image is of a painting in progress a couple of years ago. That's in the studio. It's almost done, but it wasn't quite done. I didn't like those, the ones that turned out with a colored background, but they're still around. Having said all these words about painting, and having, perhaps unadvisedly, ended by showing my own work, I'd like to quote Ken Price, the great California ceramist and sculptor who died recently at the age of 77. He said, quote, "I can't prove my art's any good, or that it means what I say it means, and nothing I say can improve the way it looks." Thank you very much. Well, I think it's never going to be the queen of the arts like it was in the 17th century, okay? And I don't think it's going to be the straw that stirred the drink like it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You know, I've used these two metaphors before. The painting is like jazz and it's like Spain. You know, jazz is never going to be top 40, you know, but it has a certain, you know, following and a certain liveliness to it. And people, you know, who used to listen to, you know, George Lewis and Louis Armstrong, then listened to, you know, Coltrane and Miles Davis, now listen to Brad Mehldau and some other people, and it keeps going along. But it's over here. But it's solidly over there, and there's a community and an audience for it. The second thing is Spain. And this is always good because, you know, Spain used to have an empire. They owned Flanders. That's why all those good Flemish paintings are in the Prado. But now it doesn't. You know, the Spanish Empire is non-existent. I don't know. They might have a couple of islands somewhere out that they own. But it's a perfectly wonderful country with a perfectly wonderful culture and a perfectly wonderful language, et cetera, and no reason to do anything else than hold its head up high. Although Lionel Messi is an Argentinian, but he plays for Barcelona. You know, so I use those two. But that's a kind of might be construed as an evasive answer. So to try to be a little bit more honest, it's almost like there's always painting is dead, and there's painting is dead, and then there's painting is dead, is dead, and then there are resurgences in painting. One of the resurgences that it periodically does is because of that ugly little thing in the real world called economics. A lot of times people get rich, and they get fabulously rich, and there's a lot of money around. They used to say that, you know, and even when time gets tough, the French put their money on the walls, which they used to buy little impressionist paintings. But people have money, and they want to buy art objects with them. And it's easier and better, and you don't have to be, you know, have a warehouse like Marty Margulies does in Miami, where I showed that Ernesto NATO, you know, installation. Paintings come back in, and they came back in the, you know, in the late 70s and the 80s when there was a boom, you know, when all the neo-expressionists and Julian Schnabel and David Solly and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's happened again. There are painters out there, you know, Dana Schutz and a few other people, but each time that little burst doesn't seem, you know what I mean, as big as the last time. So I think, you know, the general trajectory is level at best. That's what I think. But do not, you know, make any economic decisions on anything that I said. Or even what to major in, you know.